On October 29th, the first message was sent over ARPANET, the forerunner of the Internet. Based on packet rather than circuit switching, the new technology completely revolutionized the way we communicate with one another.
On November 17th, negotiators from the Soviet Union and the United States met in Helsinki to begin the SALT I negotiations, a broad-based initiative aimed at limiting the number of strategic nuclear weapons on both sides.
Although deemed too boring to receive much media coverage at the time, still officials from both sides had met and begun discussing their differences. The road to peace may not be as exciting as the road to war, but then the toll is not so much either.
On March 1st, the first nuclear non-proliferation treaty went into effect. Ratified by 56 countries, it was the first tangible step taken to halt the spread of nuclear weapons since their introduction in 1945. But once again, events here on Earth were overshadowed by those in space, when the portentously named Apollo 13 reported in typical military understatement, "Houston, we have a problem."
The problem was the explosion of one of two service module oxygen tanks. The blast blew off a 13-foot section of the command module's outer skin panel, rendering it uninhabitable. Fortunately, the lunar module was still available for the crew to use as a lifeboat.
The crew's safety was threatened a second time when dangerous levels of CO2 began accumulating in the lunar module. The LEM's CO2 scrubbers were designed for 2 passengers, not 3. Exhausted by the higher than anticipated workload, the LEM's filters needed to be replaced by filters from the service module. Unfortunately, the service module and the lunar module had been designed by rival companies, which had each incorporated different shaped filters into their designs.
If ever there was a case for industrial standardization, this was it. Houston set about the problem methodically, developing a plan for a makeshift filter, designed exclusively from materials available to the Apollo 13's crew, which they radioed up to the astronauts before the situation became critical. Although certainly not routine, the rest of the flight home was less dramatic, and Apollo 13 splashed down safely in the Pacific Ocean on April 17th.
But the real significance of Apollo 13 was not its misfortunes, as much as the way they had affected people all over the world. When Apollo 13 launched, it was seen as just another manned spaceflight. In fact, Americans had become so complacent after the first 2 successful Apollo missions that the television networks passed up opportunities to broadcast live specials of the voyage.
But now, 3 men were in peril far from home. The event united us in the same way that an external enemy often unites a divided country. When Apollo 13 finally splashed down in the waters of the Pacific, there was a shout of joy that could be heard around the world. Yes, the Apollo 13 astronauts were Americans, but they were men first, and men and women from every race, creed, and color identified with them and rejoiced together that they had come home safe. To this day, it is hard to think of a moment when the world was more united.
On April 22, 1970, the U.S. celebrated its first Earth Day. A week later, U.S. forces crossed into Cambodia to attack Viet Cong bases there. The offensive caused widespread unrest at home and sparked riots on campuses all across the country.
It was the protest groups organized during this period that spawned the leaders of the post-war American environmental movement.
On January 12, 1971, All in the Family, the most successful sitcom in American television history, debuted on CBS. The series helped Americans heal the ideological rift that divided boomers, represented by Mike and Gloria, from their parents, represented by Archie and Edith Bunker, by using comic relief to reduce the tension between them and foster constructive dialogue.
How are you going to admit that the war was wrong?
I ain't talking about that war. I don't want to talk about that rotten damn war no more. I'm talking about something else. And what he done was wrong. Saying he won't go. Well, you think the whole people of this country can say whether or not they want to go to war? You couldn't get a decent war off the ground that way. All the young people would say no, sure they would, because they don't want to get killed. And that's why we leave it to the Congress, cause them old cracks ain't gonna get killed. And they're gonna do the right thing and get behind the president and vote yes.
Arch, if my opinion is of any importance...
Certainly your opinion's importance. A Gold Star father. Your opinion is more important than anybody else in this room, and I want to hear that opinion. And I want these young people here to hear that opinion. Now, you tell them, Pinky, you tell them.
I understand how you feel, Arch. My kid hated the war, too. But he did what he thought he had to do. And David here did what he thought he had to do. But David's alive to share Christmas dinner with us. And if Steve were here, he'd want to sit down with him. And that's what I want to do. Merry Christmas, David.
Merry Christmas, sir.
On July 10, 1971, Gloria Steinem delivered her Address to the Women of America speech. Delivered at the height of the women's movement in the U.S., her speech is considered one of the greatest of the 20th century. 8 months later, Congress sent the Equal Rights Amendment to the states for ratification. That same year, the FBI hired its first female agents, and the Boston Marathon admitted women.
On August 1st, 1971, 40,000 spectators attended the relief concert for Bangladesh staged in New York City. The event raised millions for relief and was the first in a long line of benefit concerts. Derided by many as iconoclasts a mere decade before, the concert for Bangladesh demonstrated that rock and roll musicians could also be responsible members of the community, capable of leveraging their celebrity for worthy causes.
On August 15, 1971, President Nixon effectively announced the end of the Bretton Woods system. The president went on to impose a 90-day freeze on wages, prices, and rents. Like Great Britain before her, the United States had been compelled to admit that she could not afford to police the world alone.
The speed at which the world was changing was reflected in a number of product announcements made at the end of 1971 and the beginning of 1972. Intel released the world's first microprocessor, the Intel 4004. HP introduced the first scientific handheld calculator, and Volkswagen announced that Beetle sales had exceeded those of the Ford Model T when the 15,007,034th Beetle rolled off the assembly line. The writing was on the wall for American car manufacturers, although none heeded the warning. The full-size American car was drowning in a sea of higher gasoline prices.
On February 21st, President Nixon, a lifelong anti-communist, paid an unprecedented 8-day visit to the People's Republic of China to meet with key Chinese officials. Mao was sick at the time, but rallied himself to meet with the president. Nixon's trip to China was probably the most spectacular foreign policy initiative since Edward VII visited France in 1903. It laid the foundation for everything that came after: the end of the Vietnam War, the splitting of the communist bloc, and the beginning of China's rise as a global economic power, along with the subsequent increase in the standard of living for 1 billion of the world's people. Lincoln once said that the best way to destroy an enemy is to make him a friend. In a world overshadowed by the destructive power of nuclear weapons, it is now the only way. 3 months after the visit, President Nixon and Secretary Brezhnev signed the SALT I Treaty, freezing the number of strategic ballistic missile launchers at existing levels.
The next month, November 1972, at a scientific meeting in Honolulu, Herbert Boyer and Stanley Cohen conceived the concept of recombinant DNA. That same year, Paul Berg recombined DNA in a test tube. Recombinant DNA technology dramatically changed the field of biological sciences, especially biotechnology, opening the door to genetically modified organisms.
That same month, Atari introduced its first generation of video games with the release of Pong, the first video game to achieve commercial success. Imagine being able to play a video game in your own home. No doubt a few of the games made it onto the shelves by Christmas. But in Washington, in 1972, the White House was contemplating a different kind of Christmas message. Talks with North Vietnam had stalled, and President Nixon was determined to get them restarted. Henry Kissinger urged the North Vietnamese to settle or face the wrath of an impatient president. North Vietnamese officials steadfastly brushed the warnings aside.
Here comes Santa Claus, right down Santa Claus Lane. He's got a bag that's filled with toys for boys and girls again. Hear those sleigh bells jingle, jangle.
5 weeks later, on January 27, 1973, U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War ended with the signing of the Paris Peace Accords.
A week later, the Midnight Special began its 8-year run on American network television. The 90-minute program followed the Friday night edition of The Tonight Show starring Johnny Carson. Americans were staying up later to watch TV, now that there was something to watch other than a test pattern. 24-hour television was on the horizon.
On March 1st, 1973, Pink Floyd released its magnum opus, Dark Side of the Moon. The record remained in the charts for 741 weeks from 1973 to 1988, longer than any other album in history. One of the most popular songs off Dark Side of the Moon is Money, something that Donald Wetzel, Tom Barnes, and George Chastain were no doubt thinking about when they applied for a patent for their ATM machine on April 3rd. That same day, the first handheld cellular phone call was made by Martin Cooper in New York City. DNA, the internet, computers, video games, 24-hour television, ATMs, and cell phones. The modern world was taking shape.